Hi folks, Dave, the Honest Audiophile. Is there such a thing as a musical reference IEM for a small budget? When I say small budget, I do mean anything that is current price under $100. There have been a few IEMs that have come across my desk that kind of fit into the musical reference. And those are the Etymotic ER2 SE, the Tin Hifi T2, and also the Moondrop SSR. But does the Tin Hifi T2 deserve to be added to the list? What is a reference IEM, you ask? Well, I believe that is a IEM that is about as flat, neutral as possible without losing details and extension. A reference IEM should be not adding in any coloring or any flavoring to the sound that isn't natural or realistic. And then a musical IEM, to me, is one that sounds natural and realistic without being bloated or excessive in any of the frequencies. A musical IEM should be an accurate portrayal of the music in the real world that is enjoyable and detailed. So here are my honest impressions of the Tin Hifi T2. Some driver specs, they have two dynamic drivers, a 10mm woofer and a 6mm tweeter, 16 ohms of impedance, 102 decibels of sensitivity, and a frequency response of 12 Hz to 40 kilohertz. I find that the Tin Hifi T2 is solidly built. They're built like their siblings, the T2 Pro, the T3, and the T4. I find that they're fairly durable, and believe it or not, they're not very heavy, even though they are an all metal build. I find the form factor to be a little odd, and its fit is kind of strange. It's kind of hard. It works, but it doesn't work. It's just different. Cable is really good. I like that the ear hooks just kind of conform to your ear, and they are very well controlled, very well behaved. Cable is nice and lightweight, thin, and doesn't tangle or twist. It's just a very good cable. I really enjoy the cable and the ear hooks. I find that comfort is very good. Stock tips worked extremely well. Silicones, the foams, weren't my favorite. But I did change over to JVC spiral dots, and that's because the spiral dots just fit me a little bit better. Didn't alter the sonics whatsoever. So all sound impressions are done with the JVC spiral dots. Speaking of sound impressions, the bass on the Tin Hifi T2, it's not going to win any awards for bass lovers. It's not going to win any awards at all in the bass department, but it won't disappoint if you are seeking details and resolution. The bass has a good amount of extension, but don't expect any rumbles or any sort of real kicks and thumps. The notes are weighted nicely, and they have a good presence, but they do not drive home with authority. The Tin Hifi T2 has very good speed and accuracy, and instrument isolation and separation is fantastic. The Tin Hifi T2 is natural and realistic sounding. As far as the mids, wow, the mids are just special. I really enjoy the mids on the T2, and most Tin Hifis, I do enjoy the mids, so that's no shock whatsoever. Balanced and cohesive vocals and instruments. Everything just sounds correctly placed, airy with a kiss of natural warmth. And the T2 just puts on a full display of an accurate portrayal of natural and realistic. I really enjoy the mids. The uppers are slightly forward, but do not venture into sibilant, harsh, or bright mode. Everything about them is just even and prominent. Even though there's a slight elevation, everything sounds balanced and cohesive. The treble. Let me start off by saying this is one of the best trebles I've ever heard in an IEM, period. It does not matter the price. The Tin Hifi T2 treble is fantastic. There are all kinds of ways that you can portray treble in an IEM. You can have boosted upper treble. You can have rolled off middle and upper treble. You can have boosted all the way. You can roll it all off. You can do a mixture of all sorts of things. And a lot of times the treble, especially in all of those combinations I mentioned, just sounds unnatural. But the Tin Hifi T2 got it right. The treble on the Tin Hifi T2 is just fantastic. There's a good amount of extension on the T2, but it's slightly boosted. But it is controlled and has the correct amount of boost, in my opinion. When I say that I love treble, and I am a treble head, I love a controlled treble. And I am talking about treble that the T2 has. Vocals and instruments are just wonderful to listen to. They just flow. And harshness and brightness only presents when it is built into the music, in the mix. It doesn't always portray it, and it's not always prominent, and it just shows it when it needs to, and it's just beautiful. The T2 treble is a treasure that is rarely found in a IEM, especially in this price point. Soundstage and imaging. Now, the soundstage isn't going to win any awards again. It's not the widest, and it's okay with average width, depth, and layering. But what the T2 does very, very good is that it images exceptionally well. You'll be hard-pressed to find an IEM in the price point that it is, and in the price points that go up and beyond the T2 that does imaging better. This is a fantastic IEM for imaging. Along with the accurate imaging, also the T2 offers instruments and vocal separation. It does a really good job. Often with average size stages, you can get a claustrophobic imaging and separation, but the T2 is far from the norm. I really like the T2 because it portrays vocals and instruments accurately. Realistically spaced, and they're separated out. They're not too far, they're not too close. They just have the right amount of space. You can easily place and follow things across the stage, and the T2 makes it extremely easy to diagnose a stage. When it comes to tone and timbre, the T2 is excellent. It sounds very natural and very realistic. Even though the overall presentation is slightly lightweight, it doesn't lack in tonal accuracy. I find that the T2 portrays instruments in a very natural and realistic way, and they're very easy to recognize. Detail retrieval and resolution is very good for the price, and it exceeded my expectations, and it competes with a lot of things that are priced a lot higher. Resolution of the details that were portrayed is high quality, and the Tin Hifi T2 is very good at giving you an accurate picture of the music and includes all that you need and then some. It's a very revealing IEM. I don't feel like I'm missing anything when I listen with the T2. I really enjoy the Tin Hifi T2 details and resolution. Now let's compare this real quick. Let's compare it to the Tin Hifi T2 Plus. They're a sibling, but their differences are very easily detected. First and foremost, the T2 Plus has a significant bass increase, and it amazingly is not as well resolved as the Tin Hifi T2. The T2 does a better job of resolving the bass than the T2 Plus, even though the T2 Plus has more impact and is just more increased. The mids are more forward and full on the T2 Plus, but again, they're not as well resolved, and they have a touch of sibilance and harshness, and that's just not present on the T2. The treble is more elevated on the T2, but yet it still sounds more natural. The soundstage and imaging are very similar. The T2 has an advantage, though, in detail retrieval and resolution. The T2 Plus would be the fun version, and the T2 is more the workhorse. Comparing to the T3, now these two are very similar, and their differences are extremely hard to hear. The T3 has a slim increase in lower bass region, and it just gives a little bit more body and a little bit more impact. The T3 has a small advantage in mids body as well, but also it is more prominent in the upper mids, and it causes it to have more moments of sibilance that you just don't get on the T2. One of the biggest differences, though, is in the treble. The T2 is more extended, more airy, and a little bit on the brighter side of things. And the T3 is more laid back and controlled. But I do believe that the T2 actually does have the more natural sounding treble. Soundstage wise, the width is very similar. The T2 may be a little bit wider, and that might be based off of just because it has a little bit more extension, a little bit more airiness in the treble. And then the T3 flexes its muscle just a little bit when it comes to depth and layering. Not a whole lot, but the T3 just sounds a little bit more refined in that regard. Tone and timbre, they sound exactly alike. Detail retrieval and resolution, the T3 pulls away just minuscule slightly. The differences mentioned are not day and night. They are very, very small. They're extremely minute differences, and it just kind of comes down to preference. Etymotic ER2 SE in comparison to the T2. Now this is a sound signature that is very, very similar. The T2 has a touch more treble extension and energy. The ER2 SE has a little bit more mids presence and gives a little bit more body and fullness. The ER2 SE also has a slight advantage with detail retrieval and resolution. And the ER2 SE sounds a touch more refined and defined. Tone and timbre, extremely similar. Extremely hard to hear any differences there. And then soundstage and imaging are extremely similar as well. Very hard to pick out any differences. If you want a slight less amount of treble and a touch more mids, then get the ER2 SE. But they're extremely close. I mean, really, really hard. And I highly recommend both of them. And then going to the Moondrop SSR. And that's going to be about the closest one in price. And the SSR has been one of my go-to IEMs and one of my go-to recommended for a long time if you're looking for a reference sound. Especially if you're looking for something that is good with vocals and instruments. And the Tin Hifi T2 is replacing that. Why? Because the T2 has a small bass advantage. It adds in just a little bit more note density, a little bit more body and weight to it. The mids are way more forward on the SSR, and they are a focal point of the presentation, whereas the T2 is more balanced and cohesive. And the SSR has moments of sibilance and harshness in the upper mids. And the SSR treble is boosted in the upper regions, and it just doesn't sound as natural and realistic as the T2. The T2 has a more refined and defined soundstage with a slight advantage in details and in imaging. And then the Tin Hifi T2, as I said, just replaces the Moondrop SSR as my go-to recommendation and as my go-to reference sound. Pairing wise, they paired with everything. It didn't matter if it was a dongle or a DAP. I used it with all of my dongles, the Odyssey HD, the NextDrive Spectra X, Xduo Link, also my DAPs, the Sony NWA105, the Sony NWWM1A, and it just plays well. The thing that the T2 does really well is it does scale with higher gear. So the more higher level of products that you pair it with, the better it sounds. It just sounds fantastic. And I know it's crazy to take a WMA and pair it with a T2, but it's a great little pairing. So I highly recommend it. And I found that the T2 is not source picky, but it does scale well with better products. In conclusion, if you haven't figured it out, I love the Tin Hifi T2. I highly recommend the T2. I find it plays well with all music genres and is perfect for all listening sessions, but really it excels for critical listening. And if you're looking for an accurate, realistic, natural, and musical reference IEM, give the Tin Hifi T2 a listen. I'm Dave, the Honest Audiophile. Thank you for watching. Please give the video a thumbs up or a thumbs down, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit the notification bell. That way you'll be made aware of when another honest impression is available. Please remember to enjoy the music, and honesty is the best policy.